Let's head to Milwaukee now. MSNBC anchor Katy Tur is joining us from the convention site, along with David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch, and Greg Bluestein, political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Great to see all of you this morning. Katy, quite a show of unity around Donald Trump last night. What did you make of it?
I got to tell you, walking around this convention hall, there is nothing but unity among the Republicans who have assembled here. And obviously, these are some of the most ideological of the Republicans, are the ones that who are most fervently in support of Donald Trump. But everybody here is on the same page. And notably, last night, we saw some former rivals of Donald Trump who've said not nice things about him in the past take the stage. Marco Rubio, obviously, from 2016, but also Governor DeSantis, who ran against him in this primary, and Nikki Haley, who for a time wasn't even invited to this convention. That is until Saturday. There's some discussion over what time exactly she was invited, but she took the opportunity to get on stage and to change her mind, I'll put it that way, about Donald Trump. Here's what she used to say about the Republican nominee, and here's what she's saying now.
The problem now is he is not the same person he was in 2016. He is unhinged. He is more diminished than he was.
You don't have to agree with Trump 100% of the time to vote for him. Take it from me. I haven't always agreed with President Trump. But we agree more often than we disagree.
We agree more often than we disagree from he is unhinged. That is a big journey to cross. Nikki Haley did it last night, and it's so important for the Republican Party because Nikki Haley garnered a significant amount of support in the primaries. Obviously not enough to win, not by a long shot, but enough to potentially be a spoiler for the Republican Party. Her voters were voting for her because they did not want to vote for Donald Trump, and that was really proven after she got out of the race, Anna, and she was still getting 10, 13% in states that she wasn't even running in any longer. So this was her attempt to tell those moderate Republicans, those non-MAGA Republicans, that it's better inside the tent than outside of the tent, that the Republican Party, even if you don't agree with it all the time, Donald Trump, even if you don't agree with him all the time, he is still better than the alternative.
Yeah, at one point she said on the campaign trail that Donald Trump was unfit to be commander-in-chief, referring to some of the comments he had made about those in the military. David, it's been quite the transformation of not just what we're hearing from Nikki Haley, but really more broadly of the Republican Party. For years, the GOP has been dogged by infighting on the Hill. There's been this fractured ideology between MAGA supporters and never-Trumpers. The de facto head of their party was repeatedly indicted and then convicted. And yet now they appear firmly in lockstep. What do you make of it?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been covering the Republican Party for the better part of 25 years, and there are always pockets of resistance, sometimes louder than others, at events like this. And the delegates that I'm talking to here in Milwaukee tell me that they don't recall a convention that has ever been this unified, at least not in decades. And it's now Democrats, of course, that are having unity issues. I think for Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, that, there are a couple of ways to look at this. It's pretty common in American history for these primaries to be pretty knockdown, drag out, and then everybody comes together when it's time to focus on the opponent in the other political party. It's just that in the Trump era, these attacks and these disagreements have been of a personal nature, not just of a policy nature. And so it really sort of blows everyone's mind when you can see a Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis get on stage and endorse Trump and advocate for his reelection, given the things he said about them and the personal things that they've said about him. But when you look at where the general election stands today, with Donald Trump the favorite and in a very commanding position, doing better in swing states than he is nationally, I think a lot of Republicans who are thinking of voting against Trump or for Biden or writing in somebody just as a protest, right now those numbers are not nearly as significant as they were just a couple of months ago, just because of how the former president is doing in the polls.
All that being said, Greg, there have been some notable absences at the convention, including former President Bush, Trump's own former VP, Mike Pence, Senator Mitt Romney, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, some of these folks who've spoken out against him in the past. Even former Speaker Paul Ryan, he's not going to be at the RNC, which is happening in his home state. So, again, plenty of unity on display last night, but are there also cracks beneath the surface?
There are cracks beneath the surface, but if you ask the delegates if they mind that Mitt Romney isn't here, they will laugh it off, right? Because they say this is the party of Trump. And I think a perfect example is that I'm out in rural Wisconsin right now with the Georgia delegation, and there's few people who have as much problems with Donald Trump, as much reason to oppose Donald Trump as Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. He was vilified by Trump. He was wrongly blamed by Trump for Trump's 2020 defeat. He got death threats. He was the target of conspiracy theories. Trump even recruited someone to run against him in 2022. And where was Governor Brian Kemp yesterday? He was here in Wisconsin rallying Republicans to vote for Donald Trump. So, you know, if the Bushes of the world aren't here, delegates don't mind. They say that basically the internal dissent within the active Republican core has been snuffed out.
David, I want to focus for a moment on the Trump family. In his prior campaigns, it was Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Melania Trump that were Trump's inner circle. But some new NBC reporting points out it's a different troika this time. Donald Trump Jr., daughter-in-law Lara Trump, and her husband Eric Trump that has emerged in this campaign as the most influential set inside the Trump family. What do these three bring to the Trump campaign that we didn't see in the last two elections?
Well, I think we can focus on Donald Trump Jr. More than any of the other two, even though Lara Trump is, of course, co-chairman of the Republican National Committee. Donald Trump Jr. has always been known as the real Republican within the Trump family. He was Republican before anybody else was, including his father. And he is a conservative populist. He's the one that pushed hard for Senator J.D. Vance to be selected as the running mate. He is decidedly not a Reagan-era Republican and really comes to these positions authentically, whereas his father is much more transactional. But I really think the key difference in the Trump campaign this time around in terms of Donald Trump is the same in many respects, but this operation is so disciplined and professional in a way that 2016 was not. I think 2020 was, but I think Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita are able to bend Trump's ear and get Trump to pay attention in ways that even his 2020 campaign team was not able to do. And I think that's made a huge difference in terms of giving Trump an opportunity to take advantage of, really, in some cases, just the good luck that has come his way.
Katie, you spoke with Eric Trump on your show yesterday, and I want to play a little bit of your conversation.
Can you say unequivocally that if he does get into office, that he will not allow the federal government to use its powers to make abortion even harder from a federal government perspective, to not use the Comstock Act to, make it illegal to send abortion pills or send abortion tools?
I think the answer is yes.
I think the answer is yes. That doesn't sound definitive. How did you interpret that answer?
Well, and anytime you use think, no, it doesn't sound definitive. Listen, this is an area where Donald Trump and the campaign have tried to distance themselves from Project 2025, from J.D. Vance even. They're arguing they don't want a national abortion ban. Donald Trump says over and over again it is up to the states. Obviously, though, he is the person who put into the Supreme Court the justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, and he has said that he's proud of it. It's something that he said he would do in 2016. It's something that he did while he is president. He was president, and it's something that he said that he's proud of now that he is no longer president. That being said, he believes, or he says at least, that this should be a decision that is left up to the states. That's been met with some consternation within the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, evangelicals, who think that he should take it further. Obviously, in Project 2025, they're arguing to utilize the Comstock Act to make it illegal to send the abortion pill, to send tools used for abortions, also maybe to use the FDA to restrict the abortion pill even further. We've seen the abortion pill used much more in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, now accounting for most of the abortions out there. So I thought it was really important to ask Eric Trump about that, because we're all here talking about what happened on Saturday, which is also important. And there's a talk about how Donald Trump's going to change his tone. It's going to be a different convention. There's more unity. We've seen moments of that. But I'm very curious about whether this changes any of the policy, any of what he will do when he gets into office. And one of those policies that the Democrats are running on is that they believe he's going to try to make abortion even harder to get. So asking Eric Trump that was my effort to try to get somebody on the record within the Trump campaign that they would unequivocally not do it. Then again, you can only listen to the guy at the top, and the guy at the top is his father, Donald Trump.
And we now know his running mate is J.D. Vance, who has been very, I guess, vocal about his position on abortion in the past, which goes much further than the current stance the front runner, or the top of the ticket, I should say, is advocating, and that's the states get to pick. So we're going to hear from J.D. Vance tonight, Greg, at the RNC in his big headlining speech. What are you going to be watching for?
Well, his tone and tenor, just like Katie said, whether or not he'll have a more conciliatory appeal or if he'll go all in. The delegates I interviewed before J.D. Vance was picked were almost unequivocally supportive of him, because they remember these are some of the fiercest Donald Trump supporters. It's hard to be a delegate and be kind of wishy-washy about where things stand in Republican politics today. So these are the delegates that really want to go all in, who want a more youthful, MAGA successor in case anything happens to the former president. And so they want to see, the delegates here want to see a very fierce conservative come out and kind of take an unapologetic sort of angle. But of course, we heard from Nikki Haley last night talking about how the Republican Party should expand and be more big tent and go towards some of those mainstream disaffected voters who might not love Donald Trump, but they're worried about Joe Biden as well. So we'll see if he tries to strike that balance. I think he's going to go the former option, though, and go kind of all in on the far right.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.